85-year-old lady defies doctors and runs marathon. Her longevity secret stuns experts. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a world where age often dictates limitations, one extraordinary woman's defiance of medical expectations and her astonishing marathon feat uncover a long-buried secret that will challenge everything we thought we knew about the human spirit and the boundaries of physical endurance. In the heart of Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood, 85-year-old Eleanor Fitzgerald sat motionless in her dimly lit living room, her weathered hands clutching a crisp white envelope. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the tumultuous thoughts racing through Eleanor's mind. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as they traced the hospital logo embossed on the envelope's corner. With a resolve that belied her years, Eleanor tore open the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, scanned the contents quickly. The words terminal, 6 months, and palliative care jumped out at her, each one a hammer blow to her composure. She let out a long, shaky breath, her gaze drifting to the array of framed photographs lining the mantelpiece. Images of a younger Eleanor flashed before her, crossing finish lines, holding trophies, beaming with the vitality of youth. A life lived in motion, now seemingly grinding to a halt. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd outrun every opponent in her prime, but this was one race she couldn't win. Or could she? A spark ignited in Eleanor's pale blue eyes. She stood up, her joints creaking in protest, and shuffled over to the window. Outside, joggers and cyclists zipped past, their energy palpable even from a distance. Eleanor's reflection stared back at her, silver hair neatly coiffed, face etched with lines of experience, shoulders slightly stooped. But beneath the fragile exterior, a fire still burned. 6 months, she whispered to herself, her voice carrying a hint of her old determination. We'll see about that. With newfound purpose, Eleanor made her way to the spare room that had remained largely untouched for decades. Dust motes danced in the air as she pushed open the door, revealing shelves lined with trophies and medals. In the corner stood a treadmill, long and used but meticulously maintained. Eleanor ran her hand along its smooth surface, memories flooding back. As she stood there, contemplating the machine that had once been such an integral part of her life, the sound of a key turning in the front door echoed through the house. Eleanor quickly closed the spare room door and hurried back to the living room, tucking the hospital letter into her cardigan pocket. "Mom?" called a voice tinged with worry. "Are you home?" Eleanor's daughter, Samantha, appeared in the doorway, her forehead creased with concern. At 48, Samantha was the spitting image of a younger Eleanor. Same determined chin, same shrewd eyes. But where Eleanor's gaze held a rekindled fire, Samantha's was clouded with anxiety. "I'm right here, dear," Eleanor replied, settling back into her armchair with practiced nonchalance. "No need to fret." Samantha's eyes narrowed as she took in her mother's slightly flushed appearance. "Did you go to your appointment today? What did Dr. Patel say?" Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know doctors, always full of doom and gloom. Nothing to worry about." "Mom," Samantha said, her tone a mixture of exasperation and affection, "you can't keep brushing off these checkups. Your health is important." As Samantha bustled around the room, straightening pillows and checking the thermostat, Eleanor's mind raced. She knew her daughter meant well, but the thought of spending her remaining days being coddled and pitted was unbearable. No, she needed a goal, a purpose, something to prove to herself and the world that she wasn't done yet. "Actually, Sam," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "I've been thinking, how would you feel about your old mom running in this year's Boston Marathon?" Samantha froze, a throw pillow clutched to her chest. She turned slowly, her expression a mix of disbelief and horror. "You're joking, right? Mom, you haven't run in years. The marathon it's insane, even for people half your age." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes glinting with challenge. "I may be old, Samantha, but I'm not dead yet. and I'll be damned if I'm going to spend whatever time I have left sitting in this chair waiting for the end. But Mom, it's dangerous. Your heart, your joints, you could seriously hurt yourself. Samantha's voice rose with each word, her protective instincts kicking into overdrive. I didn't raise you to be a naysayer, Samantha Elizabeth, Eleanor retorted, using her daughter's full name for emphasis. I raised you to believe that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it. A tense silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fears and long-buried memories. Samantha sank onto the couch, her expression softening. Mom, I can't bear the thought of losing you. Not yet. Eleanor stood, crossing the room with slow but deliberate steps. She took her daughter's hands in her own, noting how their roles had gradually reversed over the years. Oh, my darling girl, she said softly. You're not going to lose me. In fact, I plan on sticking around long enough to see you finally give me some grandchildren. Samantha let out a watery chuckle, squeezing her mother's hands. You never give up, do you? Not in my nature, Eleanor replied with a wink. Now, how about we discuss this over a cup of tea? I think we both could use one. As Eleanor made her way to the kitchen, her mind was already formulating a plan. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles both physical and emotional. But as she glanced at the hospital letter peeking out of her pocket, she felt a surge of determination. 6 months? She'd show them 6 months. Eleanor Fitzgerald was about to embark on the race of her life, and she had no intention of coming in last. The early morning mist hung low over Boston Common as Eleanor Fitzgerald laced up her running shoes for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Her arthritic fingers fumbled with the laces, a stark reminder of the challenge that lay ahead. But as she straightened up, taking in the quiet beauty of the park at dawn, she felt a familiar thrill course through her veins. Eleanor had snuck out of the house before Samantha's daily check-in call, leaving a hastily scribbled note about meeting old friends for breakfast. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was indeed meeting an old friend, one she had neglected for far too long. The open road. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor began a slow warm-up walk. Her joints creaked in protest, unused to this level of activity. She ignored the concerned glances from early morning joggers, their faces a mix of surprise and worry at the sight of an elderly woman in running gear. You've got this, Ellie? She muttered to herself, using the nickname she hadn't heard in years. As she picked up her pace to a light jog, memories flooded back, the feeling of wind in her hair, the rhythmic pounding of feet on pavement, the sweet burn of exertion in her muscles. But reality quickly set in. After just 100 yards, Eleanor was gasping for air, her chest tight and legs wobbly. She slowed to a stop, bracing her hands on her knees as she fought to catch her breath. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe Samantha was right. Maybe this was a foolish endeavor. Excuse me, ma'am? Are you all right? Eleanor looked up to see a young man in his late 20s, concern etched on his face. He was clearly a serious runner, his lean physique and high-tech gear a stark contrast to Eleanor's faded sweatpants and ancient sneakers. I'm fine, young man, Eleanor wheezed, trying to muster some dignity. Just taking a breather. The young man's expression softened. I hope you don't mind me saying, but you might want to start with some walking before jumping into running. It's important to build up gradually, especially. He trailed off, clearly not wanting to mention her age. Eleanor straightened up, a familiar spark of defiance in her eyes. Especially for old folks like me, you mean? She said with a wry smile. Well, let me tell you something, Sonny. I've run more marathons than you've had hot dinners. The young man's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Really? That's amazing. I'm training for my first marathon now. It's tough going. Tough, yes. Impossible, no? Eleanor replied, her breathing slowly returning to normal. What's your name, young man? Jack. Jack Moretti, he replied, extending his hand. Eleanor shook it firmly. Well, Jack Moretti, how would you like some advice from a seasoned pro? For the next hour, Eleanor and Jack walked laps around the common, with Eleanor dispensing wisdom on everything from proper hydration to mental preparation. Jack listened intently, scribbling notes on his phone. As they completed their final lap, Jack turned to Eleanor with a grin. You know, Mrs. Fitzgerald, you should really consider coaching. You've got a wealth of knowledge. Eleanor chuckled. Oh, I've got bigger plans than that, Jack. I'm going to run in this year's Boston Marathon. Jack's jaw dropped. That's incredible, but are you sure it's safe? The training alone is brutal. Safe? Eleanor scoffed. Nothing worth doing is ever entirely safe, Jack. But I've got a score to settle with Father Time, and I intend to win. As they parted ways, Jack still looking slightly shell-shocked, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, today's attempt at running had been humbling, but it had also rekindled something she thought she'd lost, the joy of the challenge. Returning home, Eleanor was unsurprised to find Samantha pacing in the living room, phone clutched to her ear. Mom, she exclaimed upon seeing Eleanor. Where have you been? I've been worried sick. Eleanor breezed past her daughter, heading for the kitchen. I told you, dear. I was out with old friends. Now, how about some breakfast? I'm famished. Samantha followed, her eyes narrowing as she took in her mother's attire. Are those running clothes? Mom, please tell me you weren't out there trying to run. Eleanor busied herself with making tea, avoiding her daughter's piercing gaze. Samantha, we've been through this. I'm going to run that marathon, and no amount of fretting on your part is going to change my mind. But it's dangerous, Samantha protested. Have you even talked to Dr. Patel about this? Eleanor set down the kettle with more force than necessary, turning to face her daughter. Samantha Elizabeth, I am a grown woman. I don't need permission from you or any doctor to live my life the way I see fit. Samantha's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. I just don't want to lose you, Mom. Is that so wrong? Eleanor's expression softened. She crossed the kitchen and enveloped her daughter in a hug. Oh, my darling girl, you're not going to lose me. In fact, this might just be the thing that keeps me around longer. As she held her daughter, Eleanor's mind drifted to the secret she'd kept buried for so long. The real reason she'd stopped running all those years ago. The truth that, if revealed, could change everything, and not just for her, but for Samantha too. But now wasn't the time for such revelations. First, she had a marathon to train for, and Eleanor Fitzgerald was nothing if not determined. As she released Samantha from the hug, Eleanor's gaze fell on the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. The date of the Boston Marathon was circled in red, a mere 5 months away. It would be a race against time in more ways than one. But as Eleanor sipped her tea, a plan began to form in her mind. She would need help, professional help, and she knew just where to start. Dr. Patel might not approve of her marathon ambitions, but Eleanor had a feeling he'd be very interested in the secret she'd kept hidden for over half a century. A secret that could change the face of medical science forever. Eleanor smiled to herself. The race was on, and she had no intention of coming in last. The waiting room of Boston Medical Center's geriatric unit was a sea of muted beiges and soft blues, designed to soothe its elderly patrons. But for Eleanor Fitzgerald, perched on the edge of an oversized armchair, there was no comfort to be found. Her fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on her knee as she waited for her name to be called. Mrs. Fitzgerald? A young nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. Dr. Patel will see you now. Eleanor rose, smoothing out her blouse. She followed the nurse down a long corridor, the smell of disinfectant sharp in her nostrils. As they approached the doctor's office, Eleanor steeled herself for the conversation ahead. Dr. Rajesh Patel, a man in his early 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up as Eleanor entered. His welcoming smile faltered slightly as he took in her determined expression. Mrs. Fitzgerald, he began, gesturing for her to sit. I must admit, I was surprised to see your name on my schedule so soon after our last meeting. How are you feeling? Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, her back straight, chin lifted. I'm feeling quite well, Dr. Patel. In fact, I'm here to discuss my plans for the future. Dr. Patel's eyebrows rose. Oh, and what plans might those be? I'm going to run in the Boston Marathon, Eleanor stated. her tone brooking no argument. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Patel's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Eleanor, I don't think you understand the severity of your condition. The strain on your heart alone. I understand perfectly well, doctor, Eleanor interrupted. But I also understand something that you don't. Something that could change everything we know about aging and human endurance. Dr. Patel leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. What do you mean? Eleanor took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating for decades. What I'm about to tell you must remain between us. Doctor-patient confidentiality and all that. At Dr. Patel's nod, Eleanor continued. Back in the 60s, I was part of a secret government program. They were experimenting with ways to enhance human performance, create the perfect soldier. I was young, broke, and desperate to prove myself, so I volunteered. Dr. Patel's expression was a mix of disbelief and fascination. What kind of experiments? Gene therapy, mostly. Things that were decades ahead of their time. Most of the volunteers experienced severe side effects. Some didn't survive. Eleanor's voice caught, old guilt resurfacing. But a few of us, we thrived. Our bodies changed at the cellular level. We healed faster, aged slower. That's impossible, Dr. Patel whispered. Eleanor smiled wryly. Is it? You've seen my test results, doctor. How many 85-year-olds do you know with the heart and lungs of someone half their age? Dr. Patel shuffled through the papers on his desk, his hands shaking slightly. But your joints, your muscles. Atrophy from disuse, Eleanor explained. I stopped running years ago, when I found out I was pregnant with Samantha. I was afraid of what the experiments might have done to her. Understanding dawned on Dr. Patel's face. And now you want to see if the effects are still active, if you can regain your former abilities. Eleanor nodded. Exactly, and I need your help to do it safely. For a long moment, Dr. Patel was silent, clearly wrestling with the ethical implications of what he'd just heard. Finally, he spoke. What you're suggesting, it goes against everything I've been taught. But if what you're saying is true, the potential benefits to medical science are enormous. He leaned back in his chair, a decision visibly forming. All right, Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'll help you, but on one condition: we document everything. Every test, every training session, every change in your physiology. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel true hope. Thank you, doctor. When do we start? Dr. Patel's eyes gleamed with the excitement of scientific discovery. How about right now? As Eleanor followed Dr. Patel to the hospital's state-of-the-art exercise physiology lab, she felt a mix of trepidation and exhilaration. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. Eleanor Fitzgerald was about to rewrite the rules of what was possible, not just for herself, but for science and humanity. Little did she know, the revelations of her past were about to catch up with her in ways she could never have imagined. The steady whir of the treadmill filled the small gym tucked away in the basement of Boston Medical Center. Eleanor Fitzgerald, wired up to various monitoring devices, jogged at a steady pace, her breath coming in controlled pants. Dr. Patel stood nearby, eyes flicking between Eleanor and the bank of monitors displaying her vital signs. Remarkable, he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Your oxygen uptake is off the charts for someone your age. Heart rate steady, blood pressure optimal. Eleanor, this is unprecedented. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, even as sweat beaded on her brow. It had been 3 weeks since their initial conversation, and the rigorous training and testing regimen was already showing results. Her body, dormant for so long, was awakening, muscle memory kicking in with a vengeance. As the treadmill slowed to a stop, Eleanor stepped off, reaching for a towel. So, Doc, she said between breaths, what's the verdict? Am I cleared for more intensive training? Dr. Patel's expression was a mix of excitement and concern. Medically speaking, you're in better shape than most of my 30-year-old patients. But Eleanor, we're in uncharted territory here. The long-term effects of pushing your body like this, we just don't know. Eleanor's eyes flashed with determination. The long-term effects of sitting in a rocking chair waiting to die are pretty clear, wouldn't you say? I'm doing this, Rajesh, with or without your blessing. Dr. Patel sighed, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. I know better than to argue with you by now. All right, we'll increase your training intensity. But I want you in here for monitoring 3 times a week. No exceptions. As Eleanor nodded her agreement, a commotion outside the gym caught their attention. Raised voices echoed down the hallway, one of them painfully familiar to Eleanor. I don't care about your rules. That's my mother in there, and I demand to know what's going on. The door burst open, revealing a red-faced Samantha, her eyes wild with a mix of anger and fear. She froze as she took in the scene before her, Eleanor in workout clothes, Dr. Patel looking guilty, the array of medical equipment surrounding them. Mom! Samantha's voice was barely above a whisper. What is all this? Eleanor straightened, squaring her shoulders. Samantha, I can explain. Explain. Samantha's voice rose an octave. Explain why you've been lying to me for weeks? Sneaking around? Missing our daily calls? I thought you were dying. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. Ms. Fitzgerald, I assure you, your mother is in excellent health. We've been conducting some tests. Tests? Samantha interrupted, her gaze snapping back to Eleanor. What kind of tests? Mom, what aren't you telling me? Eleanor felt the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on her. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it even as she yearned for it. Taking a deep breath, she met her daughter's eyes. Samantha, darling, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago. Over the next hour, in the privacy of Dr. Patel's office, Eleanor laid bare the truth of her past. The secret government program, the genetic modifications, the reason she'd given up running. With each revelation, Samantha's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, a sort of numb shock. So what does this mean? Samantha finally asked, her voice hoarse. Are you even my real mother? Eleanor's heart clenched. She reached out, grasping Samantha's hands in her own. Oh, my darling girl, I am your mother in every way that matters. I carried you, gave birth to you, raised you. Nothing can change that. But genetically, Samantha trailed off, her scientific mind clearly racing. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. If I may, Samantha, your mother's genetic modifications were made to her somatic cells, not her germline. While it's possible some effects were passed on to you, you are, essentially, your mother's biological daughter. A tense silence fell over the room. Eleanor watched her daughter's face, trying to gauge her reaction. When Samantha finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. All these years, all those times I asked about my grandparents, about your past. You lied to me. I was trying to protect you, Eleanor pleaded. I didn't know what the long-term effects might be. I was afraid. Samantha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need some air. I need to think. As she reached the door, she paused, turning back to face Eleanor. This marathon, is it really about proving something to yourself? Or is it about reliving your glory days? Consequences be damned. Before Eleanor could respond, Samantha was gone, the door slamming behind her. Eleanor slumped in her chair, the adrenaline of the day's events leaving her in a rush. She felt every one of her 85 years weighing on her. Dr. Patel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Give her time, Eleanor. It's a lot to process. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the door through which her daughter had disappeared. She'd known there would be a price to pay for her secrets, but she hadn't anticipated how steep that price might be. As she slowly gathered her things to leave, Eleanor's resolve hardened. She would run this marathon not just for herself, but for Samantha, to show her daughter that it's never too late for second chances, for redemption. The race was no longer just about defying medical odds. It was about healing the rift between mother and daughter, about leaving a legacy of truth and perseverance. Eleanor Fitzgerald had faced many challenges in her long life, but this might prove to be her greatest test yet. As she stepped out into the Boston afternoon, she squared her shoulders. The marathon was still months away, but the most important race, the race to reconcile with her daughter, had already begun. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the Charles River esplanade as Eleanor Fitzgerald pounded the pavement, her breath coming in measured gasps. Beside her, Jack Moretti matched her pace, occasionally glancing at the older woman with a mix of awe and concern. "You're doing great, Mrs. Fitzgerald," Jack encouraged, his voice barely betraying his own exertion. "Just another mile to go." Eleanor nodded, too focused on her rhythm to speak. In the 2 months since her confrontation with Samantha, she had thrown herself into training with a fervor that surprised even Dr. Patel. Each grueling session was a welcome distraction from the deafening silence that had fallen between her and her daughter. As they rounded the final bend, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar figure waiting near their usual finish line. Her steps faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Samantha?" she called out, slowing to a stop a few feet away from her daughter. Samantha stood awkwardly, hands shoved deep in her coat pockets. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. I hope you don't mind. Dr. Patel told me I might find you here." Jack, sensing the tension, excused himself with a quick nod to both women. As he jogged away, Eleanor turned to face her daughter fully. "Of course I don't mind," Eleanor said, her voice carefully neutral. "It's good to see you, Sam." Samantha's eyes roamed over her mother's figure, taking in the changes wrought by months of intensive training. "You look different," she finally said. "Younger, almost." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "I feel younger." "Samantha, No, Mom," Samantha interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let me speak first. I've had a lot of time to think, and I owe you an apology." Eleanor blinked in surprise. This was not how she had imagined this conversation going. Samantha continued, her words coming in a rush. "I was angry and scared, and I lashed out. But the truth is, I understand why you kept your past a secret. You were trying to protect me in your own way." "Oh, Samantha," Eleanor breathed, taking a step closer to her daughter. "But Mom," Samantha pressed on, "you have to understand how this feels from my perspective. Everything I thought I knew about you, about myself, it's all been turned upside down." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy. "I know, darling, and I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused you. If I could go back and do things differently." "But you can't," Samantha finished for her. "What's done is done. The question is, where do we go from here?" Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I want you to be part of this, Samantha. My training, the marathon, all of it. No more secrets, no more lies. I want you to see who I really am, who I've always been beneath the facade of a quiet, retired widow." Samantha was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the river flowing peacefully beside them. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I'd like that, Mom. I think I'd like that very much." As mother and daughter embraced, the early morning joggers passing by had no idea they were witnessing a moment of profound reconciliation. For Eleanor, it felt like a weight she'd carried for decades was finally lifting. "So," Samantha said as they broke apart, wiping at her eyes, "tell me about this young man who's been training with you. He's quite handsome." Eleanor laughed, linking her arm through her daughter's as they began to walk. "Oh, Jack? He's been a godsend, really. Reminds me a bit of your father in his younger days." As Eleanor filled Samantha in on the details of her training regimen, her miraculous progress, and the growing media interest in her story, she felt a surge of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt truly optimistic about the future. Little did either of them know, the true test of their newfound bond was yet to come. The buzz of excitement in the conference room at Boston Medical Center was palpable. Journalists from major networks and publications jostled for position, cameras at the ready. At the center of it all sat Eleanor Fitzgerald, looking remarkably composed in a smart blazer, her silver hair neatly coiffed. Dr. Patel stood at the podium, clearing his throat to bring the room to order. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. As you know, we're here today to discuss a medical phenomenon that could revolutionize our understanding of human physiology and aging. He gestured towards Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, 85 years young, has been training to run in the upcoming Boston Marathon. What makes this extraordinary is not just her age, but the remarkable changes we've observed in her physiology over the past few months. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped as Eleanor smiled serenely for the cameras. Dr. Patel continued, "Our tests have shown cellular regeneration and telomere lengthening far beyond anything previously documented in medical literature. In layman's terms, Mrs. Fitzgerald's body is quite literally turning back the clock." The room erupted in a cacophony of questions. "Dr. Patel, are you saying Mrs. Fitzgerald has found the fountain of youth? Mrs. Fitzgerald, how do you respond to accusations that this is all an elaborate hoax? Is the government involved in this research?" Eleanor raised a hand, and to her surprise, the room fell silent. "I understand your skepticism," she began, her voice clear and steady. "What's happening to me defies everything we thought we knew about aging. But I assure you, this is no hoax." She paused, her eyes finding Samantha's in the crowd. Her daughter gave an almost imperceptible nod, encouraging her to continue. "The truth is," Eleanor said, taking a deep breath, "my condition is the result of a government experiment conducted over 50 years ago. I was a volunteer in a program designed to enhance human performance. Most of the other participants didn't survive. I've carried the secret of what was done to me for decades, out of fear and a misguided attempt to protect my family." The room exploded into chaos. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed incessantly. Through it all, Eleanor remained calm, her gaze locked with her daughter's. Suddenly, a commotion at the back of the room caught everyone's attention. A group of stern-looking men in dark suits pushed their way through the crowd. "This press conference is over," one of them announced, flashing a government ID. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, you'll need to come with us." Panic flashed across Samantha's face. She started to move towards her mother, but Eleanor subtly shook her head. This was a moment she had both dreaded and anticipated for years. As the agents escorted her from the room, Eleanor caught snippets of Dr. Patel arguing with them, demanding to see their authorization. She allowed herself to be led away, her mind racing. She had known this day might come, had prepared for it as best she could. In the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the press, one of the agents leaned in close. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'm Agent Daniels. We need to debrief you about Project Methuselah. Your cooperation is crucial to national security." Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting the agent's gaze with steely determination. "I understand, Agent Daniels, but let me be clear, I will cooperate, but on my terms. I've spent half a century hiding. I won't be silenced or disappeared now." Agent Daniels seemed taken aback by her resolve. After a moment, he nodded. "We'll do our best to accommodate you, Mrs. Fitzgerald, but you must understand the sensitivity of this situation." As they led her towards the exit, Eleanor caught sight of Samantha breaking free from the crowd, running towards her. "Mom!" she called out, fear evident in her voice. Eleanor turned to Agent Daniels. "My daughter comes with us," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Where I go, she goes." For a tense moment, it seemed the agent might refuse, but something in Eleanor's expression must have convinced him. He nodded curtly, motioning for Samantha to join them. As mother and daughter were ushered into a waiting black SUV, Eleanor felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The secrets of her past were finally coming to light, for better or worse. "Mom," Samantha whispered as the car pulled away from the curb. "What's going to happen now?" Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. I don't know, darling, but whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As the Boston skyline receded in the rearview mirror, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the marathon, now just weeks away. She had trained her body to its peak, had prepared herself mentally for the grueling race. But this was a different kind of marathon altogether, one that would test not just her physical endurance, but her moral courage as well. The SUV sped down the highway, carrying Eleanor towards an uncertain future. But one thing was certain: Eleanor Fitzgerald was not about to give up without a fight. The race of her life had truly begun, and the finish line was still nowhere in sight. The sterile walls of the underground government facility seemed to close in around Eleanor as she sat rigidly in an uncomfortable metal chair. Across from her, a panel of stern-faced officials peppered her with questions about Project Methuselah, their voices a monotonous drone after hours of interrogation. Mrs. Fitzgerald, a gray-haired man in a crisp suit, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You must understand the gravity of the situation. The information you possess could change the course of human history. We need to know everything. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, her voice calm despite her exhaustion. I've told you everything I know, gentlemen. I was a test subject, not a scientist. The details of what was done to me are as much a mystery to me as they are to you. A younger official, his face etched with frustration, slammed his hand on the table. That's not good enough. Surely you must have some idea of the compounds used, the procedures performed. That's enough. The authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife. All heads turned to see Dr. Amelia Chun, the lead scientist assigned to Eleanor's case, striding into the room. Mrs. Fitzgerald has been cooperating fully. I think we've pushed her far enough for one day. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. In the weeks since she'd been brought to this facility, Dr. Chun had been a beacon of compassion in a sea of cold bureaucracy. As the officials filed out of the room, grumbling their dissatisfaction, Dr. Chun approached Eleanor. How are you holding up? She asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. Eleanor managed a weak smile. I've been better, but I've certainly been worse. Any news on when I might be allowed to see my daughter? Dr. Chen's expression softened. Actually, that's why I'm here. We've arranged for a supervised visit. She's waiting for you now. The reunion between mother and daughter was emotionally charged. Samantha rushed to embrace Eleanor, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Mom, are you okay? Have they been treating you well? Eleanor hugged her daughter tightly, reveling in the comfort of familiar arms. I'm fine, darling, just tired. How are things on the outside? Has there been much fallout from the press conference? Samantha nodded, her expression grave. It's been chaos. The media is in a frenzy, speculating about government supersoldiers and fountain of youth serums. And there are rumors that foreign powers are very interested in what's happening here. Eleanor's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared all those years ago when she decided to keep her past a secret. And the marathon? She asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. It's still on, Samantha replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. In fact, there's more interest than ever. People are calling you the Miracle Marathon Grandma. Your story has gone viral. Despite the gravity of her situation, Eleanor couldn't help but chuckle. Miracle Marathon Grandma? Good heavens. Dr. Chun, who had been quietly observing their interaction, stepped forward. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I have some news that might interest you both. We've been analyzing your genetic makeup, and we've made some fascinating discoveries. Eleanor and Samantha listened intently as Dr. Chun explained the intricacies of Eleanor's unique physiology. The genetic modifications she had undergone decades ago had not only enhanced her physical capabilities, but had also dramatically slowed her aging process at a cellular level. In essence, Dr. Chun concluded, your body is constantly regenerating itself at a rate we've never seen before. It's as if you've found a way to turn back the biological clock. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air. Samantha was the first to break the silence. So what happens now? Will the government keep my mother locked up here forever, studying her like a lab rat? Dr. Chun shook her head. That's not the plan. In fact, I've been advocating for Mrs. Fitzgerald's release. We can learn far more by observing her in real-world conditions, like, say, running a marathon. Eleanor's eyes widened. You mean? We're recommending that you be allowed to participate in the Boston Marathon as planned, Dr. Chun confirmed. Under close observation, of course. As the reality of the situation sank in, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had started this journey to prove something to herself, but now she realized it was about so much more. Her story, her very existence, could offer hope to millions. Well then, Eleanor said, squaring her shoulders, I suppose I'd better get back to training. We've got a race to win. As mother and daughter shared a look of determination, the air in the room seemed to crackle with possibility. The marathon was no longer just a personal challenge. It was a chance to show the world the extraordinary potential of the human spirit. Little did they know the greatest test was yet to come. The streets of Boston thrummed with an electric energy as thousands of spectators lined the marathon route. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, perfect conditions for the race. At the starting line, surrounded by runners less than half her age, stood Eleanor Fitzgerald. Gone was the frail old lady who had started this journey months ago. In her place stood an athlete, lean and focused, her silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. Beside her, Samantha fussed with Eleanor's race bib, her hands trembling slightly. Are you sure about this, Mom? Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After everything that's happened, no one would blame you if you decided not to run. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, darling. This is what I was meant to do. As the starting gun fired and the sea of runners surged forward, Eleanor felt a thrill of excitement course through her veins. She set off at a measured pace, mindful of Dr. Chen's warnings about pacing herself. The first few miles flew by in a blur of cheering crowds and pounding feet. Eleanor marveled at how good she felt, how smoothly her body responded to the demands she placed on it. It was as if the decades had melted away, leaving behind the athlete she had once been. At the halfway point, she caught sight of Dr. Patel and Dr. Chun in the crowd, monitoring her progress with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern. She flashed them a thumbs up as she passed, earning a cheer from the spectators around them. But as she approached the infamous Heartbreak Hill, Eleanor felt the first twinge of doubt. Her breathing became labored, her legs heavy. For the first time, she felt every one of her 85 years weighing her down. Come on, Ellie, she muttered to herself, using her old nickname. You've got this. As she struggled up the hill, memories flashed through her mind, the pain of the experiments, the years of hiding, the recent interrogations. But with each step, those memories seemed to fade, replaced by newer, brighter ones, the pride in Samantha's eyes, the excitement of rediscovering her abilities, the hope her story had given to so many. Cresting the hill, Eleanor caught sight of the finish line in the distance. A second wind filled her lungs, and she found herself picking up speed. The crowd's cheers grew louder as people realized what they were witnessing. In the final stretch, Eleanor was vaguely aware of cameras flashing, of reporters shouting questions. But all she could focus on was the ribbon stretched across the finish line. With a final burst of speed, Eleanor Fitzgerald crossed the finish line of the Boston Marathon. The crowd erupted in a deafening roar as she stumbled to a stop, her chest heaving. Samantha was there in an instant, wrapping her mother in a fierce embrace. You did it, Mom, she sobbed. You really did it. As medical staff and officials swarmed around her, Eleanor looked up to see her time displayed on the big screen. She had not only finished the race but had done so in a time that would be impressive for a runner a quarter of her age. In that moment, as reporters clamored for a statement and spectators pressed forward for a glimpse of the miracle marathon grandma, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She had faced her past, embraced her truth, and in doing so, had opened up a world of possibilities not just for herself, but for all of humanity. Dr. Chun pushed through the crowd, her face alight with excitement. Mrs. Fitzgerald, your metrics during the race were astounding. The implications for medical science, for our understanding of human potential. Eleanor held up a hand, silencing the enthusiastic scientist. There will be time for all that later, Dr. Chen. Right now, I'd just like to enjoy this moment with my daughter. As mother and daughter stood arm in arm, basking in the glow of Eleanor's achievement, they knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Eleanor Fitzgerald had not just run a marathon. She had opened the door to a future where age was no longer a limitation, where the human spirit could truly soar. The secret she had carried for so long was now out in the open, ready to change the world. And Eleanor, with Samantha by her side, was ready to lead the way into this brave new future. As the sun began to set on Boston, casting a golden glow over the city, Eleanor Fitzgerald stood tall, her silver hair gleaming like a crown. She had defied the odds, stunned the experts, and in doing so had written a new chapter not just in her own story, but in the story of human potential. The race was over, but Eleanor's journey was just beginning. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.